Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod to go over MSU's season opener on Monday, November 5th against Monmouth at the Breslin Center. Before we begin, a huge thanks to Spencer Tanke. Thank you very much for your generous gift to the show. Also, we'd like to express our appreciation to those of you or recurring listeners who are sponsors. If you'd like to send along a show of support to the show, head on over to tffinots.com/support to get the necessary links to support the show. Also, a reminder that there is still time to enter the Beat Rod contest, where you have to correctly predict the final Big Ten standings, 1 through 18. Send along your picks for an opportunity to win $100 of Nudge Printing gift cards for some fantastic Spartan apparel. The deadline is the first Big Ten game, which is sometime the first week of December. Send along your picks to me, Eric, ERIC, at tffinots.com. And be sure to also guess how many points Michigan State scores against U of M as a tiebreaker. And don't forget, they do play twice. All right, so Michigan State will take on Monmouth, and we're hoping for a better opening experience than we had last year, where Michigan State dropped one against James Madison. Now, JMU ended up having a pretty good season, and but I'd rather not deal with that a second time. So there's a small chance, too, that you might remember Monmouth, which got to a hot start 8 years ago, where they beat UCLA, USC, and Notre Dame, and almost became more famous for the antics of its walk-ons with their celebrations. So anyway, the Hawks are the opponent for this tip-off. They remember the CAA, or the Coastal Athletic Association, coached by former North Carolina point guard King Rice. 18-15 overall last year, 10-8 in league play. He's been the head coach at Monmouth now for 13 years, and his overall record is a game over 500, which in some ways is really impressive if you think about these small schools, because they spend the non-conference basically losing every game. And so to have a winning record suggests you at least have a lot of success during the regular season at a consistent rate. He has, and to that point, he's won 55% of his conference games over the years. Never been to the NCAA tournament, despite winning the 3 regular season conference titles because of just the craziness of the postseason conferences tournaments. He's been to the NIT twice, and they're not expected to have a great year this year. They're picked 8th in the league, and a lot of new players, and much like many of the teams we talk about, either with our Big Ten previews or I imagine a lot of the teams we're going to be talking about going forward this season.
Yeah. King Rice, during that period you were talking about 8 years ago, was kind of a hot name. And There was a feeling that he would likely get a chance at a high major. And it didn't end up happening, and you don't hear his name mentioned as much anymore. But 13 years in any job is pretty impressive. And I think the fact that he's been able to win at a solid rate in his leagues, and they've been in 3 different leagues during his coaching tenure. They're a fairly recent admission to the CAA. I think this is only maybe their 3rd year in that league. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he's been able to win consistently enough in his conferences, the various conferences they've been in, it probably has a lot to do with his longevity. As you mentioned, they're picked to finish 8th. As we come to expect in the portal era, there's a lot of turnover. They've got 7 new players, 5 of which are portal additions. Now, if you talk to him, and I've read some interviews with him, if anything, he's most pleased by the fact that he was able to hold on to some guys. You're going to see as we go through this, in terms of their returnees, this is a very young team. They got a ton of sophomores. And a couple of those guys were players that reasonably could have been expected to be targeted by bigger programs to move up. If not high majors, then, mid-major plus kind of leagues like the A10, that type of thing. Didn't happen. He was able to retain. He didn't really lose anybody to the portal that was a major factor for them a year ago. So he's given some candid interviews. It's interesting. One of the things he mentioned is he said that nobody on his roster is making more than 10 grand in NIL this year.
Wow.
Another thing he said that was interesting in terms of trying to improve that is they've got a very tough schedule. I can't remember off the top of my head what other high majors they're playing, but I believe they're at least playing 2 others besides Michigan State. And, it used to be that the reason you took these bye games, if you were a mid-major program where you're going to be cannon fodder against a high major, is that it provided money to allow your program to function. So things like allowing for a recruiting budget, allowing for maybe some plane rides instead of bus rides, that type of thing.
Right.
Now it's explicitly related, as in addition to all those things which haven't gone away, it's explicitly related to NIL. That's what he was talking about as a motivator for them taking these games. He mentioned something, I'm assuming it's the MSU game. He said they're getting somewhere close to $400,000 to play this game. So for a program like Monmouth, that's significant. And if that's part of the NIL equation, well, that could mean that for a guy or two that you might be in danger next spring of losing to a, let's say not even a high major, but maybe a mid-major plus, now maybe you can be competitive. Maybe.
Sure.
So it's just another way that I think most fans don't think about in which NIL is a factor with decisions that get made. I think programs like Monmouth, at least his philosophy is, hey, I've got to play as many of these games as I can schedule because it's going to be financially my program's lifeline to being able to retain players. Never mind, recruiting budgets and, box lunch meals on a trip or, any of those
right, all
things.
that stuff.
It's more than that now. So that was very interesting what he was talking about in regard to that stuff. Something else worth mentioning, like Michigan State, Monmouth had a summer European trip. They went to Italy on theirs. And so like with Michigan State, you would expect that, or at least the hope is that it means that maybe in November, they're a little sharper than some of the teams they're going to be playing. No advantage here in that both teams went on summer trips, but worth keeping in mind, I think. They only returned 2 starters from their team a year ago, but there were a few guys in addition to that were firmly in their rotation. So even though there's been a lot of roster turnover, I don't exactly look at this team as, one of the bunches like we've talked about where it's just complete roster overhaul and everybody's new to everybody else. It's not quite that. There has been some retention, so there should be some coherence in terms of what they're putting on the floor. And
of course, obviously, all teams had turnover in college basketball because you just have limited eligibility, and so you're always moving players, and just varies in how big your classes were or whatever, and so obviously more pronounced now with the transfer.
Yeah, and you're right. You would have situations where a team lost a bunch. They were senior heavy, they were top heavy, and they lost a bunch. Right. And so, that's true. But very rarely were you seeing situations, except sometimes at the lowest levels of D1, you would see it, where you're talking about like 9 new players. That didn't happen. It's a matter of degree.
Yeah, the other games, just for those interested, their next matchup against Temple, then they go they play Northern Illinois, they play in-state rival Rutgers, and they also play Seton Hall. So
there you go.
A couple of the big names,
So three high majors and I would say Temple these days is probably more of a mid-major plus, but yeah.
And they do actually take on Auburn, I guess, right before the end of the
so more.
year too. So
you see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, they're definitely getting their paychecks. So it's interesting. So the money they get, can they somehow get it to the players outside of just giving them like a sandwich or something? Because I feel like there's still some rules with the school giving the money, right?
You make a good point. And you're right that it can't be directly funneled to players. But I think that what he's saying is that it still comes down to how the program operates, and maybe in, we'll call it, indirect ways. Yeah. It's a factor. But you're correct in noting that at least for the moment, it can't function that way.
I'm also a little surprised that a school like Monmouth, which, no knock against Monmouth, but there aren't, from a value of a name, image, and likeness, you can't imagine there's a lot of value. And most players really, truly don't have, even in the pros, they don't have much value. But to have, for a very small program like this, to have any money as an NAL is kind of impressive.
Well, I think that, if you're talking about, pulling together, $100,000 for NIL payments, that's doable in the sense that, that it's always been doable. If you had, let's say, a local auto dealership or something that was a sponsor of games, you could convert some of that into this kind of stuff and maybe have some players do a local ad. I guess it probably isn't that shocking, but the reason I mentioned what Rice talked about is you put that into perspective. At Michigan State, it would be a guess, but
we don't know exactly.
But my guess is a good percentage of the roster is making six figures.
Yeah.
I hesitate to say everybody, but it could be. I know what kind of numbers were at the high end of MSU's roster last season, and that was edging into the mid six figures from what I understood. Yeah. So compare that to a team where, as Rice says, nobody's getting more than 10 grand. That doesn't mean everybody's getting 10 grand.
Right.
That just means that's a top. It's a stark difference.
Yeah. Well, and certainly I think, as we move into the next phase, which I think we both see as inevitable, and, maybe it won't happen, but I do think it's when you come to employment and contracting for players, that this will be an important aspect of budgeting for teams in order to pay their players and, on retainer, right? You have 4 or 5 dates with large programs and you're getting, $2 million or something. That's going to be budgeted in so that you can pay the players for the next year.
I will tell you what kind of gets me to the point of being even more convinced that this is an inevitability. That's the way we go. When Tony Bennett had his resignation press conference at Virginia a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about that as a direction that maybe the sport has to go that way. I don't think there's any maybe about it, but that's the thing. What I think gets misunderstood, I think most of these guys who have been leaving or like Izzo have been talking about it a lot, even though they haven't left. I don't think that their complaint is players being compensated.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't believe that. I think the complaint is you're in a wild, wild west scenario where there are no guidelines that go along with this. And so everybody at all times is a free agent. Now you can say, well, that's how the regular economy works to one extent or another. Obviously there are people who are under employment contracts that are a little more restrictive than that. But basically, most of us have the ability, if a better offer comes along, to take it, right? And so you see this comparison made. Say, why shouldn't they? Why should college students, college athletes have that same ability? Yeah, but it's also understood that part of what makes athletics function is stability. There has to be this is not good for anybody. This total annual free agent routine that's been going on. It's not. And when I say anybody, I literally mean anybody. It's not good for fans. And at some point, I don't know where that point is, but if it continues, I do think there will be an erosion of interest in the sport. There are some who would make the argument that we've already seen it start to happen, but I think that's tough to tell with any real precision. But I don't think an environment where it's year to year with everybody and there are no rules, there's no standards that apply and no stability, I don't think that's good for the sport. It's not. There's a reason that professional sporting leagues evolved in the way that they did. If you understand and you look at the history, you understand why we have things like contracts. There's a reason for that. Because if you don't have that, you don't have stability. And if you don't have stability, it is more difficult to maintain interest. Because let's be honest, none of this stuff is life or death. So you have to give people a reason to care, right? Mm-hmm. And that is part of the equation. It's an extremely significant part of the equation. Now, the other side of that is, in order for labor, in this case student athletes, to be giving up rights to unfettered freedom, they should be getting something in exchange for that, which in this case would be financial compensation. Totally legitimate. But I think that, anyway, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because Lord knows we talk about it enough. But I think that if you listen to some of the things Tony Bennett was saying, it was very much, in a general way, at least along the lines of what we've talked about several times on this podcast, that if what everybody's after, athletic departments, college presidents, coaches, players, what everybody's after is something that's not this chaos, then the only solution that I can see that will get you there is an employment context being brought to bear somehow, some way. Now, the particulars get fuzzy. Are you going to have salary caps or, those kinds of things? Fine. There's a lot of room to work out the details. But as a general rubric for how it's got to operate, it has to be that. And that was one of the things that Tony Bennett mentioned in his resignation press conference. And I think that when it's a guy like Tony Bennett, who is nobody's idea of a radical, when he's saying that, it kind of tells you the jig is up. It's a matter of when they're actually going to give in, they being the universities, when they're in, and or the NCAA, when they're going to give in and accept that this is how it's got to be. So in some form, this is how it's got to be. Because this annual free agent stampede is doing nobody any favors. By the way, as a fan, just one more thing. As a fan, and we've talked about this too, apart from fan interest and all those things, I do worry about the quality of game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's a legitimate cause for concern.
Yeah. Well, I would always thought of Bennett as a Cavalier, but I guess maybe he's not more conservative than that. All right. So, hey, let's talk about the game and talk about Monmouth and their starters. That's brought to you by the Brothers of Just Do Gutters. It is fall season, which means there are leaves everywhere. If your house is anything like mine, they're on the roof. But for me, they're not in my gutters anymore because I had leaf guards put on by the Brothers of Just Do Gutters. So I'm not getting on a ladder all fall long with all that water that's stuck in the gutters. And getting your hand freezing cold and getting cut on the gutter edges and stuff. So anyway, I don't do that anymore. It's great. I just watch the leaves and think, not my problem. You got to rake them up later and all that sort of stuff. But at least as far as on my roof causing problems, it doesn't cause me any problems because I called the Brothers Just Do Gutters and I recommend you do the same. If you're thinking about it, have them come by and at least just get an estimate or something. You won't regret it. They can cover you if you're on the east side or the west side of the state. The brothers, all they do is they just do gutters. So that's their specialty, whether it's the downspouts, whether it's just the gutter lengths, maybe it's your business, whatever it is, they can take care of it. You can head on over to our support page at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/support. And there you can find links to get estimates, no matter where you are in the state of Michigan. They'll come out and take a look at it. 10% off, you mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. And they sponsor the player that Michigan State needs to keep in the gutter. So we'll start with the starters here for Monmouth. We'll begin with Madison Durr, a 6'5 junior.
Let me just offer a quick. This is my best guess.
Yes, right.
So do not hold me to it. Monmouth, unfortunately, has not played any exhibition games that I could find.
Except in Italy, and you didn't watch those streams, did you?
But even those, there was. I read the game accounts, but there wasn't any box score. There was no indication in those game accounts as to who actually started. So this is a best guess. Don't hold me to it if there's a change or two. Most of these guys, I think, absolutely will be starters, but there's one or two that maybe might be off. Basically, the 1 and the 5 are the spots that I'm not totally certain.
Okay. All right. So what I'm hearing from you is that you're certain these are the right lineups, just like you're certain the 1 through 18 for the Big Ten final standings.
Right.
So we'll begin with potential starter Madison Durr, 6'5 junior transfer point guard from the Citadel. He averaged a little under 12 points a game, shot 43, 27, and 76, and had a 3.3 to 2.2 assist to turnover ratio.
Yeah, it's interesting with this team, and you're going to see it as we run through this lineup. They don't start. They do have some legit height in their reserves. Their starters, that I don't think it's going to be a particularly big starting lineup in terms of 6'11" guys, that type of thing. But they've got good positional size kind of across the board. So Durr at 6'5", that'll be an interesting challenge for presumably Jeremy Fears. And so that's something to watch for. Durr obviously has starting experience. The numbers don't knock you out. Other than the scoring, 12 points a game is solid, means that he was a guy that had a lot of usage for the Citadel. And I would expect, I'm not 100% certain he's going to be a starter, but put me at about 95. He seems the likeliest candidate for sure. The three-point shooting obviously is something they'll hope can improve. And the assist to turnover numbers don't tell a story of a particularly dynamic point guard, but we'll see. As I say, the size is what really caught my attention.
Well, then his counterpart potentially is Jack Collins, also 6'5 junior, averaging 10.7 points a game and 6.5 rebounds a game, shot 42, 32, and 67. And this is a guy who's going to shoot a lot from deep. He averaged 6 3-point attempts a game last season.
Little more than that, actually. Yeah, I would say it's safe to assume that Collins will be firing. He was their second leading scorer last year, by the way. So he's a guy that got a lot of usage, got a lot of shots up last year as a sophomore. I don't think anything's likely to change this year, except that they will hope that, again, the efficiency rises a little bit. 32%, not a great number when you're taking that many threes. You would hope that it gets up into at least the mid-30s for them this year.
Then we have Abdi Bashir, 6'7 sophomore, averaged 6.3 points a game on 38, 39, and 75 shooting last year as a freshman. And so he's listed at 160 pounds, so he's a little on the, I guess it's a little thin, but not too bad.
No,
he also shot a lot of threes.
No, that's really bad. That's really bad.
Oh, yeah.
A 6'7" frame.
6'7".
That's really bad.
I was thinking about Bingham last game, and he was like 170 pounds, but he's 6'9" or something.
Yeah.
Somebody, he was real thin.
I've seen game photos from the Italian trip of Bashir, and I think that listing is accurate. Sometimes these things are off. I don't think it's off. In fact, they might even be padding it a little bit. He
turns sideways. He looks pennies in his pockets.
He disappears. He's painfully thin. Now, that said, he's very skilled. He averaged 7 made threes per game on their Italian trip. So he hit 21 threes for the trip. That's a lot. And again, the percentage, 39% last year, is pretty good. He played some. He was in their rotation. He wasn't a starter, but everybody's kind of understood that he's a guy on the come, and they expect him to become a real factor this year. In fact, he was an honorable mention All-CAA pick in the preseason. So it's not just Kane Rice that thinks he's going to be a lot better. He was also one of the two guys that King Rice identified as a player that could have easily opted to hit the portal and didn't, decided to come back. But they think he's going to take a major step forward. He was their leading scorer in Italy. Good height, at least at 6'7". Not necessarily, I hesitate to use the word size because that implies some
is
things
one
that aren't
direction.
there. But, he's going to be matched up probably with Frankie Fiddler to start. And that'll be I think it's going to be very interesting to see, and we'll get back to it when we turn to the keys. That's where that lack of bulk could be a factor. Height-wise, it's an even battle. But I wonder about the physical mismatch there. But offensively, look, Bashir's going to be a weapon. Decent athlete, very skilled, obviously, and they think he's ready to take a big step up as a scorer.
Then we have Jarrett Valencia, 6'9", 190-pound sophomore forward. He's one of two returning starters, along with the Collins you mentioned earlier. He averaged 8.9 points a game, 4.4 rebounds a game on 50, 41, and 57 shooting.
Yeah, and the three-point shooting you should take with a little bit of a grain of salt because it was on low volume. He was a bit under 2 attempts per game, so he wasn't like Collins where he was firing them up a lot. But Valencia is the guy that they view as, although Bashir has indicated maybe he pushes for that role, but I think at least for now the expectation is Valencia is the guy. He's a preseason second-team All-CAA choice. Started as a redshirt freshman and was very productive, but they think there's a lot more in there. Versatile. Again, a power forward only going 190 pounds. There's an issue.
A little less
there.
Power there.
Height-wise, 6'9", he's fine. But there's not so much power and more forward. So, but regardless, I think it's clear that this is a guy who's going to be, if not the focal point, one of the focal points for this team.
And finally, with the anticipated starting 5 is Cornelius Robinson, 6'8", 225-pound sophomore, averaged 5.1 points a game, 3.8 rebounds a game, and shot 47, 19, and 70.
Yeah, he was their top rebounder in Italy. And this is a guess because I think there could be several guys potentially who could start at the 5, but he seems to be the one who's been the most productive. So even if he doesn't start, I think he's likely to be their most productive interior player. And again, I keep saying this is a young team. Yeah, there's some experience, but you look at this, 2 juniors and 3 sophomores I've got, and there's some other guys in the freshman and sophomore realm who figure to play for this team as well. So it's a young group for King Rice. I'm assuming it's one that he's going to be hopeful he actually has the opportunity to grow with if he can retain these guys.
Right. So let's move on to the expected reserves. We'll start with Andrew Ball, 6'9", 215-pound sophomore. He was injured last year, and he averaged double digits in play in their trip to Italy. 2 years ago, before he got injured, he was averaging 4 points a game on 36, 31, and 68 shooting.
Yeah, he definitely projects as an inside-outside threat. Got good size, but it's funny. They list about 75% of their roster, they list as guards. So 6'9", 215-pound guy, I'm not sure he's really a guard, but he's obviously a perimeter, has a perimeter element to his offensive game, but he also rebounded pretty well in Italy. So I think Ball's a guy we could see play some 4 for this team as well. And again, it wouldn't, even though he's not really anybody's idea of a center, would it be a total shocker if he starts at the 5? No.
Right.
But I've got him slotted here.
Sure. Well, and then in some respects, it doesn't matter who's 4 or 5, and except maybe defensively, depends how you run your offense. So next we talk about Justin Ray, 6'3" freshman guard from South Carolina. He's just seen as a scorer at this point.
Yeah, they were high on him. King Rice, I saw talked about him a little bit. They think that he really has the potential to be an offensive threat, not really a point guard, much more of a go get a bucket kind of guy. I expect him to be in the rotation and to see the floor in this game.
Then we get Eric Demings, 6'1" sophomore transfer from Utah Tech. He averaged 7.5 points and 2.2 assists a game as a freshman, although he averaged 2.6 turnovers a game, shooting 38, 33, and 65.
Yeah, again, this is where it starts to get fuzzy as
Right.
to who's likely to assume what roles. I think there's a reasonable chance that Demings would be the backup at the point, but it remains to be seen as it plays out. He seems like the most obvious candidate for that because even though the efficiency numbers aren't great from last year, he has actually played the position.
It's important. Jeff actually played it. Then we have Quinn Peters, 6'6" sophomore, played 11 games last year, so maybe we'll see a little bit more of him.
The expectation is that we will. There's not a lot to go on in terms of what to expect from him other than his size should allow him to play definitely on the wing and maybe even some small ball four as well. But he played a lot more, it seemed, in Italy than he did last year. So I think he's yet again another sophomore who's probably going to step up into a bigger role.
Next would be Chris Morgan, 6'9", 245 pound senior transfer from North Texas, where he averaged 0.8 points a game and 0.8 rebounds a game.
Yeah, and these next three guys are all big men portal additions, and they all have a similar profile in this sense.
They're big
none
men.
None of them played significant
Right.
roles last year where they were. So, and again, if one of these three guys were to start at the 5, I guess it wouldn't totally shock me. But when I looked at production from the games in Italy, I didn't see a lot coming from this group. That said, I've got to believe that at least one, if not multiple of this group, are going to play some kind of role because they actually offer size, legitimate size, and it's something that you would think Monmouth will feel like they need, even if it's in a limited way.
Well, the second one of that group that you mentioned is Jordan Mika, 6'8", 225, transfer from Georgia Tech. Didn't play last year for Tech.
Yeah, and again, the production before that wasn't much, but 6'8", 225 is 6'8", 225. And that size might allow him to add some rebounding and interior defense to the mix. I mean, that's something that King Rice talked about explicitly in regard to him as a way that he thinks he might be able to help.
And the final player is Doc Mordor, 7-footer, 200 pounds, junior transfer from Cleveland State, where he averaged 0.7 points a game and 0.8 rebounds a game. Again, like the other two, but not a lot of production.
Yeah, very limited
team.
Playing time, but
7 feet.
and that 7 feet, the 200 pounds bit concerns you, but
Yeah.
7 feet, you would think that maybe he can give them at least a little bit of rim protection. Obviously, this stuff will be less of a factor once they get into their league, you would imagine. It's just this particular matchup, I think the lack of bulk in so many of these guys on the Monmouth roster has to be a concern going up against Michigan State.
All right, so which player do you think Michigan State needs to focus on to keep in the gutter? Brought to you by the brothers, Just Two Gutters.
It's a really close call between two players. I'm going to go, based on the fact that he led them in scoring in Italy, I'm going to go with Bashir. But Valencia could lead this team in scoring. It wouldn't be a shocker at all. But I'm going to go with Abdi Bashir.
Yeah, well, and I think, I can't remember exactly what the formula was for James Madison to beat Michigan State, besides Michigan State missing every single shot from outside. But I feel like they just had timely, I guess, buckets that they made, and were just able to, they were tough.
They had some good, James Madison had, there was some toughness. They also had some effective mismatch players. So guys that were smaller, but were still able to be productive. I'm drawing a blank on the kid. They had a kid who was a forward at like 6'7", who played a lot of 4 for them. That was really difficult. But this is not James Madison. James Madison was a known quantity coming into last year. It bothered people, and I understand why that Michigan State lost to them. But that was a team that everybody knew was going to be good and was going to challenge in their league from the beginning. There was no shock to the fact that they were a good team. and they got themselves into the top 25 for a while last year. They didn't stay there, but they did have a run and made the NCAA tournament, I believe, and their coach is now the coach at Vanderbilt. So this is not James Madison. This would be if Monmouth were able to steal a win in this game, it would be a much bigger upset than James Madison was last year. So put that into perspective.
Right. Yeah, I think the metrics came at the end of the season, the loss to James Madison was not horrific. It was not
not at all. That was not a quote unquote bad loss. I'm not saying it was good, but it wasn't a damaging loss. This one would be the kind of loss that would be damaging.
Okay. All right. So then let's move on to the player that cleans the glass the best. This is brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you need your windows cleaned, whether you're a business, maybe a high-rise apartment complex, your home, whatever it is, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids can take care of that. They can give some quick service, very meticulous, well-priced, and they get up in the ladder so you don't have to. They can power wash your house or building as well. They'll do pretty much anything when it comes to maintenance of your house on the outside. So call the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find those at our support page at the finalfoursnottheschedule.com/support. You won't regret it. They do fantastic work, and they're super easy to work with. So again, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, sponsoring the Clean Your Glass segment of the show here, where Rod and I have to predict who will clean the glass best for Michigan State. I don't think we've gotten any right so far. The plan was who leading off the season would be whoever did best the last game, but I think we both flopped there. It's Paula and you had Cooper. I think they both had like 4-2 or something when Kohler ended with 11. So since you were in last place in the Beat Rod contest last year, I will let you go first.
All right. I'll go with, and this is a tough call because Jackson Kohler has very clearly been their best rebounder in the exhibition games. If you take both games in combination. Right. But I'm going to go with Zapala. Okay. I think he'll bounce back. He was not great against Ferris. I think got derailed by a couple of moving screen calls. But I think he bounces back, and he's my pick.
All right. Well, that's good because I was going to pick Kohler anyway. So I think
there you go.
There we go. We'll see who cleans the glass best for Michigan State in the game, which is always funny. My wife's always nudging me. Oh, there's another one. You better hope you gets a rebound there. All right. So finally, we go on to the 5 keys of the game brought to you by Nudge Printing, what we're looking for in this game. And Nudge Printing, if you need something printed, maybe if you're a nonprofit or a business, you're going on a trip or something like that, Nudge Printing can actually do that as well through their custom printing shop. You also get 20% off. You mentioned Final Four when you do your order. They did it for our robotics team at our high school. And the nice thing about it is when they do it, they will ship directly to people and the people pay them directly. So you don't have to actually handle the money yourself. And as you know, if you try and put together some sort of shipping or fundraiser or something, distribution and collecting of money is sometimes the most painful part of the process. So they take that out of your hands. So it's really nice. So if you want to do something like that, a fundraiser for your school, talk to Gabe and his team over at Nudge Printing. You can find links to that at their on their website, nudgeprinting.com. Also, of course, you can get all the great Spartan gear. They provide our prizes because their stuff's just awesome. It's our favorite of our family. And so I highly recommend you head there because it is also getting close to the holidays and maybe it's time to start thinking about those things and don't be one of those last second shoppers. So first key to the game is size. You mentioned Monmouth has some size, but not really the big size except sort of in reserve. And then I feel like these games are always tricky because you have two sort of schools of thought. Now, Monmouth is not as small as some other schools that come in, these very small mid-weighters where they're, 6'7" like their biggest guy, but where you have these teams where they have to, do you try and play small and just force Michigan State to adapt, or are you just getting, or can you, are you forced to play your guys who don't play much? Are they going to be forced to play the 7-footer because they're just getting, mauled on the inside or off the boards or something like that? So I think that's always the tough question for any team in these sorts of games, like who has to adapt to who first?
Yeah, and it will show up on the interior, but honestly, the spot that I'm going to be locked in on early is the 3, because you're dealing with Bashir, who's clearly a talented kid, but as I said, I've seen photos of him playing in August in Italy. 160 might be generous. Frankie Fiddler is, and this is why he was brought in. He is a physical wing. We've already seen it. He is capable of posting people up. He knows how to use his frame and his size to create shot opportunities. And I think that's going to be very interesting to watch to see if Michigan State goes to that well early for two reasons. One, to get good shot opportunities, but two, you might be able to get one of their two best offensive players in early foul trouble.
Right, exactly.
Because
attack
now,
him. Yeah.
Now, the flip side of that is Frankie's got to be smart and not be overzealous and pick up some offensive fouls trying to do that. But I think that's one spot that I'm kind of locked in on early to see, is that somewhere where Michigan State's physical advantages really start to play. In general, you're talking about primarily rebounding and then interior play at both ends being where it would show up. And so you would certainly hope that Michigan State's physical advantage would play out in a way that gives them an edge.
Well, and also you look at that 3 spot too, that when Fiddler comes off the court and you replace him with Carr, again, you've got a really physical specimen, a guy who should be able to defend against him. And that may be one of those things too, where, Fiddler, if he's having trouble defending Bashir in the perimeter, I think, Carr out there, one would expect, especially this year, the way he's looked so far, he'd be able to handle that okay. And he could still maybe even punish him inside as well.
Yeah, it's hard to tell because I don't feel like we've seen anybody yet, and this even goes back to Spain, where there was a true test of Fiddler. Yeah. But that said, I haven't seen anything glaring on the defensive end, which was my concern initially when they brought him in. It always has to be your concern. You're bringing a guy in who was a primary scorer at a lower level. Oftentimes, that player wasn't asked to do as much defensively as Michigan State will demand from everybody who sees the court, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was a worry. And that Frankie did not seem to be like a high level athlete either. But thus far, I'm going to reserve the right to change my mind on this as we start to see better opposition. But I haven't seen any reason. There haven't been any just bold neon red flags that have been popping up with him defensively. But you make a good point about Carr, because Carr may be a little bit of a different kind of challenge. Not a guy who we've seen really employ post-up game, but yeah, the strength and obviously the high-level athleticism could pose a problem here as well for Bashir, potentially.
So the second key to the game is tempo. So Monmouth usually plays fast under Coach Rice, but they don't usually play this kind of team like Michigan State. So, what happens here? I mean, obviously Michigan State always likes to run, especially early in the season. They look like they're running more. I say that because we saw them run quite a bit in Spain. They didn't run hardly at all in Northern, and they ran a lot against Ferris. So, I mean, I suspect the Northern's more an outlier than what we expect to see most of the year.
As is usually the case in these kind of games, when Michigan State is playing an opponent that generally their program DNA is to play fast, and that has been the case with Monmouth. The big question is, does Monmouth just try to play their game, or do they do things specifically designed to try to match up with Michigan State, which means being more concerned about floor balance, slowing down, minimizing MSU's chances to get into transition? That's always an open question, and until you see it start to unfold, how Kane Rice has prepared his team. Most of the time, I think you see teams playing the way they intend to play all year, which frankly is the smartest way to go, because I don't know how much you get out of changing who you are for a one-game scenario in the season opener. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're playing a game for an NCAA tournament bid, okay, maybe there's a reason. But this, I just don't see it. Now, Monmouth used to be, you were talking about 8 years ago where they made a lot of noise with some regular season upsets. In that period, they were usually playing very, very fast, like a top 50 tempo team nationally. Lately, they haven't been quite that level. They've been more in the middle of the pack. And again, I don't watch them enough to know whether that's a result of opponents kind of doing to them in their league what Michigan State gets done to them in the Big Ten, or whether it's that they just haven't been quite as committed to running, maybe because of personnel. I don't know. But I'm expecting this to not be a slowdown game, and I'm expecting it probably to be a game where you see Monmouth spring a few leaks in transition defense. And so you would hope that it's a situation closer to the Ferris game than the Northern Michigan game from an MSU perspective.
Well, that brings us to number 3, the offensive glass, something that Michigan State has really struggled on the last few years. And they showed signs last game against Ferris, the last exhibition game, of some dominance there, which is what you expect from Michigan State. But we have not seen that last year. I mean, how many times last year we say this is a team they should,
last couple of years.
Yeah, poor defensive rebounding team, and you think, okay, there's a chance to get going, and they just never did. And so, are we going to start seeing that for real? I tend to think we are, but until we see it, we haven't seen it, right?
And really, it goes back to pre-COVID. It goes back to the 1920 season was the last time that Michigan State had a Michigan State kind of offensive rebounding team. But it's been particularly bad the last couple of years. I too would like to think there'll be a change, and there are good reasons to think that will happen. I'll just mention a few. One is that I think Jackson Kohler is probably their most, certainly among their bigs, is their most natural offensive rebounder. And I think if you are a believer that his role is going to expand from where it's been into something where he's maybe playing closer to the high teens or maybe even into the 20-minute a game category, you would think that will have a little bit of an impact. The bigger thing, I think, is that there's some reason to believe that the perimeter group, which has long been a problem in my view, in terms of rebounding at both ends, quite honestly, is set to be better. And I think that's based on a few guys. We talked about Frankie Fiddler. We haven't really seen him break out yet with a rebounding game. But if you look at his track record at Omaha, he was a very good rebounder. Now, again, you're translating performance from one level to another. It doesn't necessarily happen neatly. But I'm not saying I expect him to be a 6 to 7 rebound a night guy the way he was there. Right, I think if he's a 4 rebound a night guy, that helps. And I do expect that's going to show up at some point. Cohen Carr, we've definitely seen more from him in Spain and in these exhibition games than we saw at any time last year in terms of that high motor, playing with intensity, keeping balls alive, even ones that he doesn't get credited for a rebound with. He's part of that effort. Mm-hmm. And so I think him playing an expanded role and playing differently than he did last year will help. And then this may or may not be at the margins. It kind of depends on how big the role is that these guys play. But they're 2 freshman guards. Chase Richardson and Kurt Tang have already shown a nose for the ball off the glass. And I think if they play, decently large roles, I don't mean 20 minutes a night necessarily, but, that they're actually factors in the rotation, that will help as well. So I think there's some reason to be optimistic on that front, but we need to see it happen, and no better time than the opener to start to establish that as a habit.
Yeah, and before we get to the last key, but I mean, I think one thing I feel like with those freshmen, I think you probably expect to see 15 to 20 minutes combined between them at least initially here, these first couple games, and that's what we've seen so far, like in Ferris, and so wouldn't surprise me to see that much.
I think that's a reasonable expectation for those two guys as of right now, but I would say over the course of the season, we've got to see how it plays out.
Yeah,
because I do think there's a chance that you could see that number move north. I don't
I
rule
think there's
that
a
out.
reasonable chance. Yeah, I don't think it's except that there's so much talent elsewhere. It might be hard to pull off, but again, performance is what is going to dictate where they are and what they're going to be playing.
It is, and we've talked about it. It's challenging, especially for Kurtang. It's challenging because and I got into a dialogue about this on the Spartan Mag board, and people don't. I think sometimes people have difficulty in distinguishing between when you're talking about what you think is going to happen and what you want to happen.
Right.
I want, just for the record, I want Kurtang to be playing double-digit minutes because I think he's ready to produce. He does a lot of things well. He's a shooter. He looks like he can defend already at a good level. And that rebounding thing, he's just got kind of a nose for the ball, right?
Yeah.
But it depends whether there's enough minutes available for him depends upon a lot of things that are beyond the way Kurtang is playing. And this idea that, well, the way you solve that is you don't play the big guys that we don't like and you go small and then it works. And then there's a role for 10 minutes for Kurtang. Well, that might sound good, but I look up and down Big Ten rosters. We just spent seemingly months going through previews of the other 17 teams in this league. And what I see is, once again, a ton of size. Now, you can say, well, but there aren't a lot of proven, it's not like whatever 3-4 years ago where you had
Dickinson and Edie
Coburn and Dickinson and Garza and these guys who had done it. Okay, that may or may not be, it may not be quite at that level, but it doesn't have to be. If you don't have a good physical match for a 7-footer with some bulk, that's a really good way to turn a middling offensive player into a really productive one when you just can't guard him physically, And so anybody who thinks that, well, we can get away with just maybe Cooper and Zapala combining for 12 to 15 minutes a night, not going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, not going to happen. And I've seen enough of Jackson Kohler over the first 2 years of his career to be relatively convinced that, well, let's put it this way. Who's the best corollary for him in recent Michigan State basketball history? I would argue more than anybody else, it's Joey Hauser. Because Joey Hauser, you would see Michigan State occasionally try to go small ball 5 with him, and he'd get swallowed up.
Yeah.
But he got to a point that he was eventually able to at least be functional at the 4. And I think that's where Jackson is. And I think that's why I think Izzo sees that same thing, that, hey, he's just not able to hold up against 5s, real 5s, even ones that aren't great players, but they're just big. He's not holding up against those guys. And so I think that small ball thing isn't happening. Bottom line, is a long, winding discussion, but we've talked about before, this all has a domino effect in terms of the roles that guys are going to be in, and who's playing the 5 and how many minutes does eventually have an impact likely on Jace Richardson and even more so Kurtang. But it's a long season. And there are other ways that guys' roles can expand, like guys in front of them not playing as well as you need them to. That's one way. Injuries, God forbid, is another way.
Yep.
So we'll see. But if those guys are playing decent roles, I think they can have an impact on the offensive glass as well, to bring it back around to that key.
Good segue back into what we started there. Fourth key to the game is perimeter defense. As you may have noticed when I was going through the shooting earlier, they've got a lot of guys who are dangerous outside the 3, especially the player needs to be kept to the gutter, Bashir. And with this team like this upset, you have to hit some 3s, you got to hit some shots. And so if Monmouth wants to win, they have to be pretty pretty effective outside the arc, I would guess.
Generally speaking, games like this one, when you see upsets, it's extremely rare that 3-point shooting on the part of the underdog is not a huge part of it. And these guys have attempted a lot of three. They were shooting a lot of threes in Italy. So I think it's part of the plan. Now, Kane Rice doesn't have, it's not like he's got 3 or 4 guys that were high 30, low 40s shooters on high volume coming back. But I think there's a feeling that there may be potential. You know, Bashir, again, didn't take a lot of them last year, but he did shoot them well when he did. Well, he hit 21 threes over 3 games in Italy. So he's obviously intending, we can reasonably assume, intending to be much more of a factor there. You know, they have other guys too who are in that lineup who at least were taking a lot of threes. So I think if Michigan State wants to win this one comfortably and not be in a tough situation, the best way you ensure that is you don't let these guys get off to a great start from deep. As we often talk about, percentage against you is tough to control, but attempts is something that you can have a little bit more of a regular impact on if you can hold down attempts. And that's something that is often within a defense's control. One thing I would note from both the Spanish trip and the exhibition games, and I think I've said this here before, my observation is Michigan State this year is playing a little higher line defensively on the perimeter. If you look at where guys are guarding opponents, there's not as much sagging. You know, and that's a good way to hold down 3-point looks. Now, you know, you've also got to be able to switch effectively and all match up in transition, all of those things too. But playing a higher line, playing a little more aggressively on the perimeter in terms of where you're picking guys up can be part of that equation. So I'm going to be interested to see if that's something that we're looking at again, as we have been in these exhibition games. If Michigan State's guards are really playing kind of aggressively on the perimeter, it's a good way to hold down 3-point attempts.
All right. And the fifth and final key is rotation. So I think, you know, the starters probably are what we saw in the last 2 games. I don't think that'll change at this point.
Yeah.
Obviously going forward, it always can change, always subject to change with Izzo but for now, I think it's more curious to sort of, you know, how they play. Do you play Booker and Kohler together a lot, or is it, I mean, you know, those sorts of questions. Where does Carr play? Does he play the 3, the 4? Those sorts of things, I think.
Yep, and kind of what we were talking about, the domino effect of
right.
from the 5 to the wings, it will have an impact. You know, I'm with you. I'm going to be surprised if Sapala doesn't get to start at the 5, and the other 4 spots are pretty much baked in for now. At least I don't think there's much of a reasonable chance of any changes there. So, but here's the thing. I don't feel like we've yet had a game where we've truly seen Michigan State the way that we're going to in terms of how the rotations work. And I mean that in 2 ways. It's both the amount of minutes the individual guys are getting and then the combinations, who's playing with whom. One hint, I saw Izzo make this comment before the Ferris game. It's something that people should probably keep in mind. He said Michigan State, in his view, has 8 starters. Yeah. And the guys he mentioned were the 5 starters that we've seen. And then off the bench, Trey Holloman, Kohler, and Carr. That those were his 8 starters, so to speak, right? So if I take that at face value, that should show up in terms of what we're talking about. Like those would be guys, and I think that's right. I think we all assume that. Like Trey Holloman, we're going to see a lot. You know, Trey Holloman's almost certainly going to get into the 20s, I think, in terms of minutes played, between backup point guard minutes and then playing off the ball. I think he will. I think Jackson Kohler, we've seen play a lot in these games. And his performance has not done anything to damage the case that should continue. And then we've also talked about Cohen Carr. When he's been at his best over the Spanish trip and these 2 exhibition games, boy, that's a guy who can really impact a game. If he's playing with a high motor and kind of just flying around out there, that will make a difference.
Yeah.
In terms of the results of Michigan State seeing. I don't think there's any question about that. So that's your top 8. I think that's fairly safe to assume.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question becomes after that. We don't know, Carson Cooper broke his nose again in the Ferris game. So we don't know yet. When we're recording this on a Friday, we've even got a couple days between now and game time on top of that. But as we're talking, we don't know where he stands in terms of his ability to play. I'm going to assume he plays, but we don't know how much. And that will impact things, This would be a game that it would seem Michigan State, if they wanted to go small, could get away with it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they will. Because, again, it's kind of about you're not playing this game really. It's not just about this game. It's not even mostly about this game. It's about setting yourself up for what you're going to be going forward. At least that's the way I view it. But Cooper would be an open question. And then, again, you get down to the rest of the rotation, and you're talking about Tang and Richardson.
Mm-hmm.
Like where do those guys fit into this thing in terms of how much they're going to play? I'm going to be shocked if Jace Richardson doesn't see double-digit minutes, even in this game. And I think his role is probably going to expand as the year goes along. Tang, to me, is the more questionable one. You just don't know yet where he fits in.
I guess we'll leave it there. And just a reminder that please leave a written review on your podcast player, whatever you listen to, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or something else like that. Please leave a written review and 5 stars. It really helps the algorithm, helps other Spartan fans find a show. And so until next time, the Final Four is not on the schedule. Go Green.